Ibrahim, can you tell us what you think of President Jacob Zuma's expanded cabinet? Will it make a difference?
Well, again, potentially, I think an expanded cabinet is not in and of itself necessarily a bad thing. It does depend on the role, function, and mandate that that cabinet is going to dispense with. Now, 2 months into this expanded cabinet, um, clearly in some areas there's been some movement, particularly in defining some of the areas targeted for industrial policy. But in other areas, I think there hasn't been too much, particularly which everyone is keenly watching, the Planning Commission and the Monitoring and Evaluation Unit, in which you have two ministers, both of whose roles and mandates have not been defined in relation firstly to each other and secondly vis-a-vis other cabinet ministers. So I think that is a critical area of concern. Secondly, even though I think the expanded cabinet in some areas, particularly in the economic cluster, has made certain movements towards defining what the areas and critical focus for industrial policy are going to be, what that has done, I think, is because of the lack of detail, does not specify whether there will be government subsidies, whether there will be tax breaks, whether there will be export processing zones, and other sort of subsidies and concessions which will be provided in those particular areas. And secondly, depending on the extent of the subsidies and concessions which are provided in that area, may introduce an element of arbitrage, because it simply does mean that if I'm an investor or a young entrepreneur or a startup, I would rather go into one of those identified sectors because that's where I would be able to best capitalize. The difficulty with this again is that depending on the extent and the level of subsidies and concessions which are given, you may find that labor is going to have to enter into a more serious bargain with the state about where the location of those startups and entrepreneurial activity is concentrated, because it means that because if you want to promote economies of scale, someone who starts up in those industries would obviously be located in an urban node, which of course will help in absorbing employment and so forth, but it does mean that you will neglect the rural areas. If you provide those concessions and subsidies for people in those sectors to be concentrated to start factories or whatever it is, in areas in which people would not typically want to go to in the first instance, it means that those entrepreneurs are going to have to seriously consider what the input costs for them are going to be. Transportation, infrastructure, ability to attract skilled labor, other inputs which are required for manufacturing and for industry. So those are going to have to, somewhere along the line, some cost is going to have to be absorbed by someone. And so some thinking is going to have to be concentrated in that area. But we can talk a lot about that because that's the area of cabinet in which there has been a degree of activity which has been occurring quite vigorously in the economic sector. The other sectors, I'm not so sure that there has been as much vigorous activity. Of course, there's been talk that the Social Development Ministry would be going out to do a whole range of consultations, which is encouraging, but clearly they're going to do these consultations within the confines of the current social policy, which many people argue is inadequate. And it's inadequate because of the level of social transfers in our society, while some people argue is high, other people argue is not as high as it ought to be. Or if it is adequate, it is concentrated in all the wrong areas. So I think there are critical questions being asked that if over the past 10 years, close to 75% of our budget has been expended in the social sector, education, health, and social services, particularly in social development, yet we haven't seen tangible development results in those areas, then clearly budget allocations ought to happen in areas in which there are greater efficiencies rather than in areas in which there are lesser efficiencies. And so the dichotomy here is that it is necessary to have to invest in health, in education, in social services. But if the developmental results are not as good as they ought to be, and in some cases are in fact quite poor, then there have to be critical questions to ask about building capacity in those areas, and the indications in those areas, particularly when one looks at transport and the recent doctors' strike and the state of public health care, the evidence does point to the fact that capacity is low. The second area in which I think Cabinet has not been as responded, even though it as responsive as it could be, even though it's been expanded as widely as it has, is in the area of consultations around the new mooted national health insurance policy. And clearly opposition parties are going to have much to say about this, as do ordinary citizens. It is a very necessary intervention, I think, simply because we do have a system in which people who can afford quality health care get it, and those who can't are burdened with having to go to a public healthcare system which does not in fact deliver to them. The same is true conceptually in other areas of our public life, which is why to a degree in developmental terms the 17th Amendment Bill does make sense, where you want to transfer assets, where you want to give national government the ability to control and maintain national standards, particularly in service delivery. Because if we look at the example again of the issue of cross-subsidization of services, where relatively wealthier areas would pay per capita slightly higher rates, taxes for the services that they use, to cross-subsidize neighboring or poorer areas nearby. Our previous experience in South Africa with that has elicited either people wanting to go to the Constitutional Court because they believe they're being unfairly treated, or tax boycotts and rates boycotts, as we've seen even amongst those who are privileged. So certain of these interventions, whether it be the National Health Insurance Scheme, whether it be the 17th Local Government Amendment Bill, are necessary interventions. But they ought to have been more widely consulted. They need to be more properly defined. But at the same time, we also have the requirement that those who are slightly more privileged in our society are going to have to give up some of their privileges to ensure that there is a greater degree of redistribution. The fourth area in which I think that there are big problems is that we have a tax base of close to around 5 or 6 million and a population size of close to 49 million, which is unsustainable in the long run. So clearly many of these people who are outside of the tax system more slowly have to be brought into the formal economy. And some of the interventions which are mooted either in state structure, either in economic development terms, either in social development terms, might assist in doing so. But it does mean that we have to reimagine a new social contract between our citizens across race, across class, across privilege.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa on South Africa's opposition parties, constitutional reform and cabinet.